Welcome to Food Supply Unchained, a podcast aiming to explore and discuss the U.S. government regulations and policies that shape our food supply chain. I'm your host, Christine Heiser, and today I'm going to discuss the history of immigrant labor in the U.S. and how, without both documented and undocumented laborers, America's food system would collapse overnight. Before the sun rises, thousands of workers have been picking, packing, and processing our food. Most of them are immigrants. But how did this become the norm? And at what cost? This episode gets to the root of the federal policies behind our fruits, vegetables, and meat, tracing how we got here, who benefits, who suffers, and what happens if the chain breaks. I want to begin the episode by acknowledging the people of the indigenous American nations who were violently displaced from their fertile ancestral lands, which were then used for plantation agriculture, cattle ranching, and commercial farming. European colonization not only stole land, it disrupted traditional food ways of hunting, fishing, seed keeping, and communal growing. There's so much to unpack regarding this part of our country's history. At some point, I would like to do an episode where we can learn more about it in detail. For now, I will say Indigenous land loss wasn't accidental. It laid the foundation for the U.S. industrial agriculture economy, an entire system built on stolen land worked by exploited labor. I'm going to let you know now, and I know this is going to be shocking, based on my research, the U.S. does not come off as the good guy when it comes to the history of U.S. agribusiness, particularly as it relates to labor and immigration policy. We have a long history of stealing land, exploiting labor, then scapegoating the marginalized people we depended on. I'll begin by taking us back to the 1600s. Enslaved African Americans and their descendants were key to the successful launch of the U.S. agricultural system, and thus were the architects of our early food supply chain. Tobacco grown in the Chesapeake region was our country's first big cash crop. Rice grown in South Carolina and Georgia, where West African culture knowledge was crucial. The grueling labor of sugarcane production in Louisiana is often compared to Caribbean plantation systems. And in the 1800s, the U.S. grew into the world's largest exporter of cotton grown in the Deep South. Food crops such as corn, sweet potatoes, and livestock raised by enslaved people sustained plantations, local communities, and urban centers. The profits from enslaved labor fed not just plantation owners, but entire supply chains within the shipping, banking, insurance, textile, and food processing industries. They worked in fields, tended livestock, fished, hunted, gardened, cooked for the enslaver households and for other enslaved people. They preserved food, developed recipes, and blended African, indigenous, and European techniques, shaping regional diets in ways still reflected on American plates to this day. Crops were processed and shipped through ports in Charleston, New Orleans, and Savannah. And enslaved dock workers, millers, butchers, and teamsters moved goods from farm to market. Even after slavery was abolished in 1865, sharecropping and tenant farming kept families tied to land they didn't own, producing food and cash crops under exploitive systems. Until the 20th century, Black farmers in the South made up a huge portion of the U.S. food supply chain, but faced discrimination, violence, and dispossession of land. Meanwhile, white landowners and agribusinesses increasingly turned to cheap labor sources, including convict policing, which targeted Black men through racist policing. Power imbalances in land ownership, wages, and working conditions are direct descendants of the plantation economy. In 1920, Black farmers represented nearly 15% of the industry, but now make up less than 2% due to a legacy of discrimination, land theft, and withholdment of access to financial resources. Remember, we steal land, we exploit labor, then scapegoat the marginalized people we depended on. During the Gold Rush, 1848 to 1855, large numbers of Chinese laborers immigrated to California to help build. By the 1860s, Chinese workers made up about 80 to 90% of the Central Pacific's workforce, performing dangerous, underpaid work laying tracks through the Sierra Nevada mountains. After the railroad was completed in 1869, many Chinese railroad workers were displaced. Facing discrimination in urban areas, they sought work in California's growing agricultural industry. The state's fertile Central Valley and new irrigation projects made year-round, large-scale farming possible. Landowners needed cheap, abundant labor, and Chinese immigrants often became migratory workers, moving with the harvest cycles. As economic competition grew, Chinese immigrants became scapegoats for declining wages and unemployment among white workers. Anti-Chinese sentiment and organized movements like the Workmen's Party of California lobbied heavily for exclusionary policies. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed, which federally prohibited the immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years and declared Chinese immigrants ineligible for naturalization as U.S. citizens. It was the first significant law in American history to restrict immigration based explicitly on nationality or race. Is this really going to be our brand as a country? Thanks for helping us set up the railroads and agricultural infrastructures we still rely on to this day. But get out and stay out. We don't trust you because you figured out how to survive and thrive despite our oppressive systems. Ew. So what did the U.S. do? Did we rework processes and cash flow to help the unemployed white workers, as this piece of legislation claimed it would do, creating jobs that paid well enough to support an average American family? Of course they didn't. Many Chinese immigrants remained in the U.S. and continued farm labor under increasingly restrictive conditions and were joined by new waves of Japanese and Filipino workers. How did the Philippines get roped into our nonsense? On December 10th, 1898, the U.S. and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris, ending the Spanish-American War, and Spain ceded the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. This was done without Filipino consent. In fact, Filipino revolutionaries assisted the U.S. in their war against Spain and were under the assumption that the U.S. supported the Philippines' desire for independence. However, for reasons rooted in supremacy, the Philippines were deemed unfit for self-government or statehood, so instead, the U.S. annexed the territory. Filipinos were classified as U.S. nationals, not citizens, so they could migrate more freely to work in the U.S. We steal land. We exploit labor. We scapegoat the marginalized people we depended on. After the Mexican Revolution in 1910, U.S. farmers and railroads began to increasingly hire Mexican workers. On April 6, 1917, when the U.S. Congress declared war on Germany, and I don't know why, but it feels important right now to remember that Congress is the legislative branch of our government with the authority to declare war on behalf of the United States. And Congress's power to declare war is a key check on the executive branch's power, designed to prevent the president from engaging in war without the consent of the people's representatives. And if you don't believe me, you can check out your handy copy of the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 11 through 16. I'm giving a shout out now to my 12th grade government history class. Thanks to Mr. Toller, who taught us how the three branches of our government are designed to protect the rights we fight to keep. He also gave extra credit for registering to vote as we turned 18 throughout our senior year. Go Eagles. Okay, not to be over-reductive, but the U.S. entered World War I due to a combination of factors, including, but not limited to, German aggression at sea, strong economic ties with Britain and France, the ideological motivations of President Woodrow Wilson, and an intercepted telegram that kind of hurt the U.S.'s feelings just a little bit. And as a result of the war, over 2 million Americans were sent overseas, creating a massive labor shortage, leading to informal recruitment of Mexican workers. The Bracero Program concept starts to take shape, and I'll talk more about that in a minute because it doesn't officially begin until World War II. In 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act passed, which established national origin quotas and severely restricted immigration from Asia as well as Southern and Eastern Europe. There were no quotas on immigration from the Western Hemisphere, and as a result, and other Latin American workers filled gaps in labor. This period established a pattern of U.S. agriculture expanding rapidly by relying on low-paid immigrant labor, which was politically scapegoated but economically indispensable. On December 7th, 1941, Imperial Japan launched a military attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, and much of the Pacific Fleet was damaged or destroyed. And though up until this point the U.S. had officially remained neutral on the war in Europe, the attack stunned the American public and ended isolationist sentiment almost overnight. The next day, the United States Congress declared war on Japan. And you know what? Japan's besties said, no way, you're not going to mess with our girl. And just a few days later, on December 11th, Japan's Axis allies, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, declared war on the United States, and Congress responded with, of course, a declaration of war. This brought the U.S. fully into World War II in both the Pacific theater against Japan and the European theater against Germany and Italy. Over 16 million Americans were mobilized for military service, most of them young, able-bodied men who made up the majority of the pre-war industrial and agricultural labor force. This created a huge gap in the domestic workforce, just as wartime production needed to drastically increase. There was an emergency need for manufacturing aircraft, munitions, and shipbuilding. Automotive plants were converted to produce tanks and weapons, and at the peak of production, Ford Willows Run plant built a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, but required tens of thousands of workers to reach this output. Within agriculture, farms needed to produce record amounts of food for our troops and allies. Rural labor shortages were severe because many farm workers were enlisted. Transportation, railroads, and merchant shipping required massive manpower to move troops and supplies. Infrastructure and construction jobs were needed to build military bases, housing for war workers, and new factories needed to be built rapidly. I don't know about you, but it sounds to me as if there's a lot of money to be made by being in a war. Weird. At this point in history, America took a page from the "you never need to get ready if you stay ready" philosophy when it comes to our military resources. The United States military never fully returned to a peacetime footing, and to this day, the U.S. has the largest military in the world, with a 2024 defense budget of approximately $886 billion. That's more than the next 10 countries combined, including China, Russia, India, and major NATO allies. In response to the demand of labor spurred by the war, millions of women entered the workforce in factories, shipyards, and defense plants. Rosie the Riveter symbolizes this shift, and by 1945, nearly 1 in 4 married women worked outside of the home. The war also sparked the Second Great Migration, when 1.5 million African Americans left the South for jobs in northern and western cities, fueling the growth of Black urban communities and laying the groundwork for the post-war civil rights movement. Indigenous Americans also filled war industry jobs and served in all military branches, often voluntarily, in both combat and support roles. Many Japanese Americans who had worked in agriculture were interned during the war, deepening farm labor shortages and putting yet another dark and extremely sad mark on American history. Almost immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them U.S.-born citizens, were targeted by suspicion, fear, and racist propaganda. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. Approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, again, most of them U.S.-born citizens, were removed from their homes and sent to remote prison camps called relocation centers. Many owned small farms and produced a large share of vegetables, berries, and flowers. Big agricultural interests resented this competition and lobbied for their removal. Families had to leave behind their homes, farms, businesses, and possessions, often with only 48 hours' notice. Farmlands were sold off for a fraction of their value, often taken over by neighbors who lobbied for their removal. The value of the seized land, while Japanese Americans were wrongfully incarcerated, is estimated to be worth approximately $4 billion in today's money. Remember, we steal land, we exploit labor, then we politically scapegoat the marginalized people we depended on. These mostly American citizens were first sent to temporary detention camps called assembly centers, located at racetracks and fairgrounds, then moved to 10 major War Relocation Authority camps in California, Wyoming, Idaho, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Arkansas. Conditions were terrible. Overcrowded barracks, harsh weather, poor food, loss of privacy, and constant military surveillance. The U.S. government did this in the name of, quote, national security, fearing that Japanese Americans might aid a Japanese invasion. But no evidence ever surfaced of espionage or sabotage by Japanese Americans. And on December 18, 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that loyal American citizens cannot be detained, effectively signaling that the camps must close. The forced removal of Japanese Americans began in October 1942, and the war camps were fully closed by October 1946. Because the removal of Japanese workers was an additional labor loss, the U.S. needed new people to exploit. One of the largest supplements of domestic labor was our reliance on immigration programs such as the priorly mentioned Bracero Program. The word bracero translates to manual laborer in Spanish, and the program was a bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Mexico, bringing millions of Mexican men to the U.S. to work primarily in agriculture and railroad maintenance, with the goal of keeping food production steady. Workers would apply at recruitment centers in Mexico, many paying high fees, taking medical exams, and then waiting for contracts. They were promised decent housing, minimum wages, transportation, and humane working conditions. Once hired, braceros were issued short-term work visas, often 6 weeks to 6 months, with the expectation that they would return to Mexico after each contract. It ran from 1942 to 1964, becoming the largest guest worker program in U.S. history. Many braceros faced wage theft, with farmers deducting savings that were never repaid, and were often housed in overcrowded, unsanitary camps. Despite promises, labor protections were poorly enforced. Strikes and protests occurred but were difficult to sustain. Over 22 years, the program deeply shaped modern industrial agriculture, making large-scale, labor-intensive crops profitable. It cemented the idea that a low-wage immigrant workforce was an acceptable and necessary component for the U.S. food system. Many braceros settled permanently in the U.S. or returned repeatedly, creating lasting migration networks. The program set the stage for today's guest worker debates and visa programs like the H-2A visas for farm workers, and is now widely studied as an example of how economic need and political neglect can create conditions ripe for exploitation. In the 19th and 20th centuries, most American farms were family-owned, but technological advances such as tractors, mechanized harvesters, and refrigerated transport have made large-scale monoculture profitable. These resources allowed the U.S. to expand our export crops, specifically fruits and vegetables grown for national and global markets, like California's lettuce, berries, and citrus. Many of these crops are labor-intensive and, unlike grains, cannot be fully mechanized without bruising or damage. This required vast tracts of land and still a lot of seasonal labor to quickly plant, weed, harvest, and pack the crops before spoilage. The Bracero Program formalized our dependence on migrant workers. However, even after it ended in 1964, low-wage labor was still needed, so undocumented immigration increased to meet that demand, particularly from Mexico and Latin America. Meanwhile, the 1965 Hart-Cellar Act ended national origins quotas, but didn't provide enough legal pathways for low-wage labor, so the demand continued to be met unofficially. Before 1965, U.S. immigration policy was dominated by the national origins quota system, first established in the 1920s. I spoke of this earlier. It was the U.S.'s jealous response to Chinese immigrants' ability to prosper despite our discriminatory treatment of them. These prior quotas heavily favored people from Northern and Western Europe, and sharply restricted immigration from Asia, Africa, and parts of Southern and Eastern Europe. Make no mistake about it, the system was explicitly designed to keep the U.S. population predominantly white and Anglo-Saxon. Other than abolishing national origins quotas, the 1965 Hart-Cellar Act created a new preference system based on family reunification, employment skills, refugees and asylum seekers, and it created annual numerical caps, which limited immigration from the Eastern Hemisphere to about 170,000 visas per year, with a per-country limit, and Western Hemisphere countries in Latin America were capped for the first time to 120,000 visas combined, with later amendments adding per-country limits. This ended racist restrictions that had long been a part of U.S. law. For the first time, significant legal migration pathways opened for people from India, China, Korea, and Africa. Family reunification clauses meant new immigrants could sponsor more relatives, creating chain migration effects. There were some new unintended logistics issues. Newly added Western Hemisphere caps, which imposed numerical limits for the first time ever on Mexico and other Latin American countries, clashed with the labor demands and historical cross-border migration patterns. Agriculture, construction, and meatpacking industries were impacted the most. They continued to recruit migrant workers, which directly contributed to the rise of undocumented immigration, especially from Mexico, as demand for low-wage workers continued, but legal slots were limited. This is why it's super important for leaders of both companies and governments to run your plans by logistics before you start making sweeping changes to existing systems. There are a lot of us who love to find solutions based on valid data and can support almost any well-planned transition or initiative without accidentally creating a marginalized demographic within your society. It's just a thought. In short, you could say the 1965 Hart-Cellar Act transformed the U.S. demographic landscape and laid the foundation for our current immigration system. In 1960, 85% of immigrants were from Europe. By the 2000s, 85% were from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Family-based immigration is still the primary way people immigrate to the U.S. legally. The preference categories for employment based visas like H-1B for skilled workers came from this law, though per country caps continue to build backlogs. For instance, Indian and Mexican applicants can wait decades for visas. The act helped the U.S. become one of the world's most ethnically diverse societies, but also created structural tensions. High demand for low wage labor continued without sufficient legal pathways, contributing to unauthorized immigration and reoccurring debates about guest worker programs, border enforcement, and comprehensive reform. Throughout the 1970s, the demand for cheap farm and food processing labor kept rising, especially fruit and vegetable picking in California, Florida, and the Southwest, meat packing plants in the Midwest, and hospitality and construction industries throughout the country. Without the Bracero Program, many Mexican and Central American workers continued to cross the border to do the same work, but now without visas. Border enforcement was minimal, as the U.S.-Mexico border is long, rural, and lightly guarded. By the early 1980s, the number of undocumented immigrants continued growing, and politicians were worried about the scale of unauthorized immigration and its impact on wages. But employers wanted to keep a steady, flexible workforce. This makes me think, why does our government always acquiesce to corporations? It's like every time the government is forced to create legislation to protect public safety, they have to check with the CEOs of corporate America first. Are you good with this? Are you sure? Are you mad at me? Listen, I'm going to grant you all kinds of tax breaks and other ways you can still exploit people. Don't worry, I got you. Could a contributing factor be that we let corporate lobbyists buy politicians who then prioritize corporations over their communities? I don't know, probably not, right? Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, IRCA, granted amnesty to approximately 2.7 million undocumented immigrants who had been in the U.S. since before 1982, created penalties for employers who knowingly hired undocumented workers, as well as increased border enforcement. The act did not create a guest worker program robust enough to legally supply low-wage labor to support U.S. agriculture. And because penalties for hiring undocumented workers were poorly enforced, because God forbid we hold the actual corporations accountable for sourcing labor that the government has deemed illegal, creating the demand in the first place. The system kept running on an informal, precarious workforce. During this time, the U.S. saw a temporary drop in the undocumented population as people were legalized, but the underlying supply and demand mismatch continued, and so did new undocumented migration. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, reshaped agricultural trade across the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. One major impact was heavily subsidized U.S. corn flooded Mexican markets, displacing millions of small farmers. Many Mexicans lost livelihoods and had to migrate north to find work, often in agriculture, meatpacking, and food processing. U.S. meatpacking plants moved to rural areas seeking migrant labor. Border enforcement ramped up with more walls and more patrols, which pushed migration into more dangerous routes and discouraged seasonal return. Big agriculture bought up small farms, consolidating them into larger industrial farms. Ironically, corporations with record-breaking revenue created an even greater reliance on migrant labor to keep costs down and food cheap. What? Companies reduced their margins to pay their workers a living wage? What are you, out of your mind? Some employers use temporary agriculture visas, such as the H-2A guest worker program, but it's rigid, costly, and still not big enough to meet all labor demands. Food processing, meatpacking, dairy, and field crops all depend heavily on immigrant workers, both documented and undocumented. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed these workers as essential, but they still faced low pay, dangerous conditions, and few protections. Meanwhile, the visa backlogs for family reunification, which the Hart-Cellar Act created, have ballooned, leaving millions waiting for legal status. Today, our system still has no stable, humane path for year-round low-wage labor. There are repeated calls for comprehensive immigration reform, but no lasting solutions have passed Congress since IRCA in 1986. If immigrant labor disappeared overnight, crops would go unharvested, perishable produce would rot in the fields, livestock operations and dairies would struggle to feed, milk, and process animals. The scarcity of fresh produce would cause prices of fruit and vegetables to spike. Meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy costs would rise too. Fewer workers in packing plants means processing bottlenecks, resulting in less produce reaching grocery stores and restaurants. Farmers would lose entire harvests and go bankrupt. But don't worry, because I'm sure the corporations will have enough to purchase the rest of our farmland. Because remember the pattern: steal land, exploit labor, then scapegoat the marginalized people we depended on. And listen, I'm not even going to get into how farmland consolidation directly affects food safety, not just in terms of contamination risks, but also in how healthy and equitable the food system is for both consumers and workers. I'm not going to talk about how large corporate farms often plant one or two crops over massive areas, depleting soil and requiring more pesticides, or how when a few corporations control the food supply chain, they can hide poor safety practices behind contracts, subsidiaries, and lobbying. And I'm not going to mention how the centralized processing for national distribution of produce increases food safety risks and is one component attributed to the increase in recalls due to E. coli outbreaks linked to romaine and bagged salads. I'm not talking about these things today because this episode is about immigrant labor, not corporate food consolidation, but this is absolutely something to be concerned about. Immigration has almost always been at the core of the United States labor system, economy, culture, and food supply chain. The U.S. relies on immigrant labor across many sectors, but especially in agriculture, where they make up approximately 73%, half being undocumented. They make up 38% of food processing, 25% of construction, 40% of caregiving, and 30% of hospitality. People from all over the world come here to escape poverty, violence, and political instability, much of which the U.S. directly contributes to, and in some circumstances is just straight up responsible for. I'm looking at you, Venezuela. Regardless of their status, these people prop up key industries, especially our food supply chain, and we as U.S. citizens depend daily on laborers who have no path to citizenship or protections. The truth is, undocumented immigrants paid $95.6 billion in federal, state, and local taxes in 2023 alone. DACA recipients pay over $2 billion annually in taxes. They face risk of deportation, barriers to driver's licenses, housing, education, and healthcare, even after decades of living in the U.S., living in legal limbo, essential but invisible. And I don't want to hear a word from the tough on crime crowd. Statistically, undocumented immigrants commit fewer crimes than both U.S.-born citizens and documented immigrants. A study based on Texas Department of Public Safety data collected between 2012 and 2018 shows U.S.-born citizens are more than twice as likely to be arrested for violent crimes compared to undocumented immigrants. They are about 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for drug crimes and over 4 times more likely to be arrested for property crimes. Undocumented immigrants consistently occupy a middle ground between U.S.-born citizens and undocumented immigrants on most crime metrics. Over the course of the study, crime rates among undocumented immigrants remained stable or declined despite growing immigration numbers. And if a 6-year-long study conducted in Texas that concluded less than a decade ago isn't good enough for you, census-based research spanning 150 years show patterns and long-term trends that immigrants overall have never had higher incarceration rates than U.S.-born citizens. And since 1960, immigrants have become 60% less likely to be incarcerated than native-born citizens and 30% less likely than native-born whites. Broader analysis over multiple studies echo these findings, that there is no correlation between undocumented immigration and violent crime rates in communities. In fact, some data suggests that violence may decrease where immigrant populations rise and sanctuary policies operate. The American Immigration Council notes that the rate of both violent and property crimes declines as the immigrant share of population increases. From 1980 to 2022, the immigrant share doubled while overall crime dropped 60%. These trends persist even when data is adjusted for education levels, region, and demographic factors. And the last thing I'll say on this point is overstaying visas is the number one way undocumented immigrants stay in the U.S. It's a civil violation, not a crime, and is handled by immigration courts, similar to how speeding tickets are handled by traffic court. Overstaying a visa by legal structure is comparable to getting a parking ticket, not felony theft, drug possession, or other offenses handled in criminal court where guilt leads to a criminal record and potentially incarceration. Mislabeling undocumented people as criminals and illegals is misleading and fuels stigma. To wrap things up, essential workers are often the least protected, lowest paid, and most vulnerable, regardless of immigration status. Building a fair and sustainable food system means supporting immigration rights as labor rights. You might be asking yourself, what can I do as a concerned citizen regarding immigration reform to support migrants, especially people working to keep our food supply chain intact? So I have a few suggestions. You can support worker-led organizations by donating or volunteering with groups that protect migrant farm workers, such as United Farm Workers, Farm Worker Justice, National Farm Worker Ministry, and the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. These organizations advocate for fair wages, safe working conditions, and legal protections. Also, donate and leverage social media awareness for active co-ops such as Soulfire Farm or other local Black farming networks. I've left links to these groups in the show notes. You can also advocate for farm workers by making ethical consumer choices and buying from food brands and farms that commit to fair labor practices. Look for labels like Fair Food Program, Equitable Food Initiative, Certified B Corp with a labor commitment. Also supporting local farmer markets that are transparent about their labor practices. And we can push for corporate accountability by participating in campaigns urging grocery stores and restaurant chains to sign on to fair food agreements, and write to companies demanding better supply chain transparency and labor standards. You can advocate for policy reform by contacting your elected officials, local, state, and federal, urging them to support pathways to legal residency or citizenship for undocumented agricultural workers. Tell them you support the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, FWMA, which is the first agriculture labor reform passed by the House since 1986. The bill was negotiated for 8 months with inputs from farmers, labor advocates, industry stakeholders, and farm worker organizations. It makes the H-2A guest worker program more accessible while improving wage standards and labor protections. It establishes a certified agricultural worker status for undocumented farm workers who meet specified work and presence requirements, which then provides a path forward in permanent residency through continued agricultural employment. The bill was introduced and passed the House chamber in 2019 and again in 2021. But stalled in the Senate both times. The bill was reintroduced again in May of 2025 and has not reached a full House vote yet, likely due to the political sensitivity around immigration, as well as lack of support from key committee chairs such as Jim Jordan, who is an ethically compromised political obstructionist and a real overall problem, to say the least. To say more, Jim Jordan is one of the most vocal opponents of legal protections for undocumented immigrants. He consistently opposes any form of pathway to citizenship or legal status, frames immigration reform efforts as encouraging, quote, illegal immigration, and has repeatedly voted against bipartisan immigration bills, including previous versions of the FMWA. Unfortunately for us, he is the Judiciary Committee chair and plays a pivotal role in determining whether the act receives hearings, markups, or advances to the House floor. If the committee doesn't act, the bill dies. So listen up, 4th Congressional District of Ohio. JJ is up for re-election in November 2026. And in the show notes, I've listed the over 150 zip codes in his district, a link to verify your voter registration, and polling locations for listeners with the opportunity to vote this joker out of office. And to everyone, call or email your current representatives and let them know food system fairness, farm worker rights, labor shortages, and immigration reform are important components when maintaining a safe and equitable food supply chain. FWMA has been reintroduced in each of the last 4 Congresses, and if I'm a betting woman, I'd say it's likely to be reintroduced in the 120th Congress between 2027 and 2028. But it only has a fighting chance of becoming a law if people care at least as much about the voting values of their congressional representatives and state senators as they do their preferred presidential candidate. Your state representatives are the ones who actually create, introduce, and vote our rights into laws. So find out how your state reps vote on immigration reform before you cast your next ballot, ideally with farm workers in mind. However, there are other elections arguably more impactful to immigration reform and to your everyday life than the U.S. Commander-in-Chief. For instance, county sheriffs can decide whether to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. District attorneys decide how aggressively to prosecute low-level offenses often used to target immigrants. A progressive DA might avoid prosecuting farm workers for minor offenses tied to immigration status. The county commission and board of supervisors control local public health and labor enforcement resources. They can approve or fund support for farm worker services, mobile health clinics, and legal aid. Your local school board oversees access to education for migrant children. They can support bilingual programs, migrant education funding and other protections for undocumented students. Public health boards or county health directors have influence over farm worker access to mobile health care units, vaccinations, and extreme heat protections. Who is your governor? Who is your mayor? How about your attorney general? Or your city council? Some of the most impactful decisions around farm labor protections happen at the state and local levels, so pay close attention to these races and don't be a stranger to your elected officials. Call and email them regularly. Be that person, and don't sleep on your primaries. That's our opportunity to make sure qualified candidates make it onto the ballot. My point is, research candidate positions on immigration, farm labor, and worker protections before voting because each is integral to the safety of our country's food supply chain. And remember, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I appreciate that this issue is important enough for you to tune in. If you've enjoyed the content and are interested in listening to future episodes, please like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. I can also be reached on Blue Sky Social at unchainedfoodsupply.bsky.social, as well as foodsupplyunchained.com. Goodbye and be safe.